Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of M's Library. Great to be back. We haven't had an M's Library for a little while, so this is going to get interesting. We're going to talk about the book that was the 9th novel, 10th book by Fleming, published in April 1962, if my memory serves me correctly. It's the one he didn't really like that much, and it's the one that a lot of the critics didn't like that much. It's one of the shortest. And yet we're here 60 odd years later talking about, are we ready for this, guys? The Spy Who Loved Me. Here we go. And joining us tonight is an esteemed panel of Bond literary experts and myself. So I'm going to go through. We've got producer Michael, who is always with us on our podcast. Good evening, Michael.
Eating a bar of chocolate while he says hello.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. I'm happy to be back in front of the camera rather than behind.
Yeah,
and
Michael,
excited to talk about some literary Bond.
Literary Bond.
what chocolate are you eating, though?
Oh, yes, important question.
Important.
Cadbury's Easter egg.
Oh, Mahan Buchel. Very nice.
Very good. Also on the, well, we might as well just go to our esteemed president of James Bond Club Ireland and all-around great guy, Paul Lally, joins us. Hello, Paul. Welcome.
Hello. Hi. Thanks very much. Although I feel like the kid who snuck into a literary class because he was bored doing physics or something. But how's it going? I wasn't bored doing physics. I can't figure physics out. But I am delighted to be here nonetheless.
Well, wonderful. We look forward to hearing your thoughts on this now in a minute, and if there's any physics as well. Also joining us is our great friend of the club and of the pod, Fraser Lockley is here. Fraser, hello.
You're right.
How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. Yeah, I'm doing all right. Not bad. It's been a short week here, so free stuff. So all good.
Not bad at all. Good. And finally, but not for any other reason, just the fact that we went through it in that order, is our good friend Sean O'Hare. Sean, how are you?
Not too bad, Kev. Looking forward to chatting about the novel now.
Okay, cool. So, an experimental novel, perhaps. It has its ups and downs, and definitely has its fans and its haters. But let's start like we always do on an M's Library with Sean, who's going to give us his synopsis of the book. So Sean, tell us more about it.
No problem.
I'm delighted the synopsis is caught on as a thing, by the way.
We are never getting rid of it. It's staying.
Yeah.
Well, very, very quickly, I'll take you through it here. So the opening section of the story outlines heroine Vivian Michelle's growth to maturity, focusing mainly on her first two relationships with men. Both experiences leave her feeling rejected by men, also by London and also the world, so Vivian decides to travel abroad. She flies to Canada, purchases a Vesper motor scooter, and sets off from Quebec to Florida. The road eventually leads her to the Dreamy Pines Motor Court in New York State. After spending one night there, the manager offers her a temporary job for a few days until the motel closes for the season. She is left alone on the closing day with the promise that the owner will arrive in the morning to pay her. But that night, two gangsters, Har and Slugsy, arrive, explaining they're from the insurance company. Before she is badly beaten, a stranger appears at the door. Vivian discreetly lets him know her situation, and the man gallantly offers to help. He introduces himself as James Bond and says he is a policeman. The thugs reluctantly allow him to stay after Bond insists he must have a room for the night. Later, 007 tricks the thugs into thinking they have shot him in the bed, and they proceed to set the cabins on fire. Bond rescues Vivian from her cabin and finally confronts Har and Slugsy in a furious gun battle. Both men end up in a nearby lake. Bond and Vivian retire to the only remaining cabin, but Slugsy, still alive, attempts to kill the couple one more time. The ever-alert 007 takes out his gun from under the pillow and kills the hoodlum. In the morning, Bond is gone, but Vivian finds a poignant note left by the mysterious agent who will live in her heart forever. That's a quick snapshot of the novel we are about to chat. Over to you, Kev.
It's a great snapshot. And I know we're going to talk about Vivian, and the Vivian question, I think, is what we were looking at. Bond being a supporting character, Slugsy and Horror, if we get a bit of time for it. and what Fleming's intent was with the book. I do want to though start off and asking everyone a kind of a little bit of a quick opinion of it. And I'm going to start with you, Fraser, because I know you're a fan of this story. Why are you a fan of this story?
There's something wrong with me, I think, generally. But no, I'm a huge fan of Fleming's work, whatever forms it comes in. And for me, I sort of liken this book to a sort of the way that he approached some of the short stories, which were, but then extended into a whole novel. It feels like a short story that's been massively extended. If you dropped a shortened version of this into, particularly with the backstory stuff, then that likens, in my mind, how we used to write some of the short stories. I haven't got a real massive problem with it. I mean, it's certainly the most sexually explicit novel that he did, and it's certainly takes you down a different road, and you certainly at one point can be forgiven for thinking, is this actually a Bond novel? And certainly when I first read that as a teenager, that's how it came across. I kind of thinking, well, surely the guy's got to turn up at some point. But for me, I've always really enjoyed it, and I like some of the self-referential stuff that goes on, which are now, much later realised that actually he was writing pretty much about some of his own experiences as being a bit of a cad in, back in England with women, and certainly the first boyfriend that Vivian had, I'm sure has been well documented that experience was very much Fleming fumbling around in the back of the cinema with a girl, and things like that. So I kind of like the fact that he's sort of having a bit of a dig at himself, but but it's the whole horrible setup really is like a building of tension all the way through until our man turns up, and for me that's where it just takes it to another gear. Then I've always loved this book.
Cool. Michael, what's your thoughts on it?
Yeah, like I love hearing Fraser talk about Fleming. It's one of my favorite things to do.
It's because he has that slightly slow, heavily laden in gravitas voice that he delivers. I could listen to him reading out, pamphlets you get through the door for the same reason, Michael.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I can do that.
One of the things, like, I'll be honest, I found this book a bit difficult in terms of reading. So one of the things I don't generally like in books is first person narratives. It's always been something that, not that I've struggled with, but I find reading in the first person not as interesting as reading in the third person. So all the Bond books are written in a specific way. This is the only one that's written in first person. So especially, I think it would be interesting if it was written in the first person of Bond's perspective, but the fact it's in a different person's perspective makes the first, especially sections of the book, where the book is divided into 3 sections, where everything from Vivian talking about her life up until, I suppose, the kind of hoodlums and Bond comes in, I kind of find difficult enough to get through, because I think, like, I don't think it's particularly terrible, but I think there's just something about it where reading it, I just generally tend to kind of just doze off, or kind of my head wanders. And like those first few chapters of the book took me a while to read. But I think once it gets past that and gets into the them section and gets into the him section, then I think the book actually picks up quite a lot. And what I love about the book from kind of that point on is seeing Bond through someone else's eyes, and how Bond is essentially just this guy who comes in, and it's kind of a bit of a day in the life of Bond, if you know what I mean, rather than this big one story which encapsulates kind of like this big one mission. This is just Bond turns up someplace, something happens, he moves on the next day. And seeing that through the eyes of someone, I think, is actually quite cool. So I think the second half of the book definitely picks up for me, but that first half, I'd be lying if I said I didn't struggle getting through it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Paul, any particular moments and memories when you look at the book and the story, how it relates for you? How do you feel about it?
Well, I have a similar but not the same outlook as Michael, in that I find this book is ultimately not satisfying, but I don't necessarily. This is an interesting one, right? Because we're not judging this book on the same criteria that we're judging regular Bond novels, because, as you say, it's quite different, right? It's let's be real. It's kind of another angle on the same kind of fantasy. The fantasy that, Bond is the idealized man. He comes in and he saves the woman in distress, right? I think it was even compared. Didn't Fleming say he was comparing it with St. George slaying the dragon, right? So it's a fairly easy concept to grasp, right? He's the big hero, slaves the baddies, rescues the girl. And to Fleming's credit, he experiments, right? He tries to do it from the perspective of the female. My problem is I'm not sure I entirely buy his first person female narrative. It feels a little bit like, I'm not sure I'm that convinced by it, although I find it really, really interesting. And of course, it's laden with difficult stuff that has aged a little bit difficult. That's not the correct English, but you know what I mean. I think we're referring to especially that line, which we'll come to later on.
That
how shall I
line.
say?
We'll just call it that line.
We'll
Yeah.
talk about it later on. Yeah. But again, I know there are different takes on that, and I find that actually interesting. I find the background to this book more interesting than the book itself, because if you go into the background and you understand a little bit about Fleming at the time, the struggles he was going through within his own marriage, and then with the court cases and stuff that were going on, he was under a lot of pressure, and that comes through. And I think as a result, it's kind of it's almost more interesting to see where he was at in terms of mindset at the time. But ultimately, as a novel, if I was not a Bond fan, if I was not a Fleming fan, and I just came across this, I'd be going, yeah, it's fine. It's a story about a guy who drops by, beats up some thugs, and sleeps with the girl. I'm not entirely convinced by the girl's narrative. So ultimately, I think I would find it forgettable. But as a Bond fan, there's lots to enjoy about it too. So I'm kind of sometimes I'm meh about it. Sometimes I'm like, oh, no, I like this, So it's a difficult one for me.
Okay.
I'm neither all in nor all out with this book.
Yeah, I think there's a sentiment we hear around the place. Sean, I know you've got some thoughts as well. I know you got a question as well to follow up on. But how did you find the book?
Yeah, probably similar, more so to Michael and Paul and Fraser, in terms of I found the first part of the novel sort of hard to get through, but like Michael, struggled to sit down and properly just sit and read it. Probably similar to Paul in terms, I love the fact of what the background of where Fleming was at the time. Fleming definitely was trying something new, and you got to commend him for that. He's done 8 of these novels already. He was actually, I was reading earlier on there, Fleming actually tried to change his approach to writing a novel purely because he wrote the novels for adults, but they were being taught in schools, and young people who were liking these novels. He was trying to change the perspective of Bond, but I think probably in the end, I don't want to say he failed, but he probably made Bond even a greater character in terms he comes in and saves the damsel in distress, so to speak. So don't know if that experiment worked for him. I know Fleming later on tried his own, really, himself from the novel, and wouldn't allow it to be used. Only the title could be used. But I think the story really picks up from New York on when the two thugs arrive. It's more. It wouldn't be the book if it wasn't connected to James Bond. I don't think I'd be reading this book, to be truthfully honest with you. It changes again when Bond comes in. Oh, it's a character. Here we go. It's going to start. But it is interesting to see it from a different point of view. Bond is sort of floating off in the distance most of the time, and we're experiencing what another character sees, which for the first time we haven't had this before. So I do like that. But again, if this wasn't called A Spy Love Me connected to James Bond, it wouldn't be a novel I'd be picking up, to be honest with you. So we probably will get into a lot more. But Kev, what about you? What are your thoughts on the novel? Just
I think it's my thought. I find it hard going. I find it frustrating. I also find it horrific. in places. I think you've the part just before, and I know he's ratcheting up tension in there as well. But just before Bond arrives, I'm kind of wanting this done with. In a way, it's equally horrific, but it's also just tough. I find it tough going, and even the way I think Bond is in the book. I'll talk about Bond because I know we're going to go on to Vivian in a second, but even he's kind of a bit uncharacteristic. It's a bit, not quite Bond to me as he has been in other books. A few mistakes made. It just feels like it's just, to me, I want to go into a Bond book and have the formula. And I suppose I'm like most of the general public when they get to a book of, well, there's the casino scene, or there's the drink, and there's the gun, and there's the baddie, and you've none of that. And I think it's an interesting experiment and shows potential. But as a book to read, I have to kind of sit on the seat, and I'm just shuffling around the place, and I'm going, come on. And I kind of walk away from it. It's funny, and to kind of just say, I was looking here when we started to read it going, where's my copy of the book? And I don't have a copy of the book. I have it on a Kindle, I think, which is how I read it originally, because even I wasn't that drawn to it, I think, at first. So, yeah, I have a sort of relationship with it.
What are the bits that you found horrific in it? The bits that really you distastefully horrifically?
I think the two guys, Slugsy and Horror, and I think their intention towards to Vivian and that kind of
dark
ratcheting up the tension that's in there and how she's being treated, I just did not find comfortable at all. Yeah. I'm also a little bit, and I'm aware we're talking about a book where the character is the main character is female. We're all male here, but we're female. And coming from that perspective, I think it was, I know that she's a complex character in the way, and Fleming has made her that, but at the same time, I feel a disservice was a bit done to her. So I just find it kind of tough for that, and then it's kind of done quickly. But yeah,
it's anyway, funny. I remember reading them as a kid. But I just give you one last impression as a kid, and I remember. I think my mother was not keen. I mean, I was quite young when I was reading these. I must have been 13 or whatever, 14, and I remember. My mum was not keen on me reading Bond novels. She thought they were obviously too full of sex and violence, I assume. And I remember reading them going, no, I'm big enough, I can handle this. But that one stood out. And I first thought it was a bit boring at the end, but I remember thinking exactly the same thing. I did think that was pretty dark. Their intentions of what they were going to do was dark. And as a teenager, that stood out. It was a little bit less kind of like a boys' own adventure and more of a almost psychological thing. So yeah, interesting. I also remember thinking, Fleming describing women's thoughts towards men. Even as a young boy with no experience of the world, I was like, I suspect this might be bullshit. But it was just a feeling I had, but turned out to be right. But anyway, let's talk about the book.
Yep. Will we look at the character of Bond first of all? We'll maybe not spend too much time now because I know we want to get talking about Vivian, but maybe Michael, if I come to you first, and we'll just maybe look at Bond as we sort of chatted earlier. He's going to be like more of a supporting character. As I said, Bond doesn't really arrive until the final sort of third of the novel. How did it feel for you in terms of his absence? Did it make you feel more for or feel more of Bond, or did you miss the character? I know you were saying earlier on you found it a struggle. How did you feel when Bond finally entered the picture in the novel?
See, I think the cool thing about Bond turning up late into the novel, I think, is a similar thing to what they did in From Russia with Love, or Fleming did in From Russia with Love, where he doesn't turn up until kind of towards the kind of midpoint of that novel. So I think actually, funny enough, what it did was build anticipation, especially towards the middle of the book. Again, that first section where you're kind of just learning about Vivian and her life, that was kind of a struggle to get through. Once you get to the middle where Slugsy and Horror come in, it's a bit more interesting, at least. Kind of there's stuff going on, and you are kind of wondering what happens next. But there is also always kind of that anticipation of Bond's going to turn up. And I really liked at the end of the chapters for them, and it was like Vivian was in the predicament with Slugsy and Horror, and then there was a knock on the door. And there's kind of that, like, after not reading the book for a long time, you just read "There's knock on the door" line, and you're like, "Oh, geez, here comes Bond," you know. So you get kind of excited for that. And one of the things I quite like about Bond is generally how he just kind of turns up and adapts to situations going on, right? So even in the movies and in the novels, when Bond turns up and he kind of assesses the situation, and instead of just kind of coming in and going kind of all guns blazing or whatever, he obviously knows something's up straight away, but he kind of bides his time and kind of susses out everything first, and he spends the time talking with Vivian and stuff. So I quite like that from Bond. I can see where Kev's coming from where Bond's character feels a bit off, but I wonder, is that a case of, because we're not in Bond's head like we're in the other books? Fleming, like you said, is writing from the perspective of a woman. Is this how Fleming thinks a woman would view Bond?
Exactly,
And
yeah.
so maybe the Bond we're getting in the book isn't an actual reflection of maybe the Bond that was there or that we'd perceive. If we read that book maybe from the way Fleming would normally write, would we read it a bit differently? But because we're in the head of Vivian and because of the way Fleming writes that, I think that's why Bond maybe feels slightly off.
That's a very good point. Very,
Very
good,
good
point.
point.
Yeah, it's interesting when you put it like that. Fraser, what about you? How did you feel the character of Bond was in this novel?
I mean, I maybe slightly more mature than like when you think the follow-up novel Majesties is perhaps the most mature characterization of Bond. I think he's definitely an older guy. He's definitely somebody that's got some stability, but also maybe slightly wearing at the edges a little bit. He makes a few mistakes in it. I mean, the whole thing of him turning up out of the blue purely by luck, gets a puncture. And I quite like the fact that when he turns up, she thinks it's another gangster.
Yeah.
Her heart sinks, and he's standing there, and he's wearing, I think she described it as like the uniform of a gangster. He's in his dark navy trench coat. He's got his hat pulled down, and then she sort of thinks, oh Christ, it's another one, and then he just smiles, and somehow she knows it's probably going to be all right. But you're right about the adaptability of Bond. He's kind of come in. Yes, this isn't his usual thing. He's in between missions. It's a bit. I always think it's a bit. This novel makes me feel a little bit like I've always loved Die Hard as a film, and I kind of feel when I read this is definitely a character that's put in a situation that he can help with. But in that circumstance, he wasn't planned to be there. He wasn't called in. He wasn't assigned to it. He's kind of just coming along. He senses the danger by these guys because he's used to, dealing with co-rags and hoodlums and whatever. So he also
Rapscallions.
knows how her rapscallions, exactly, and he sees her genuine fear. She doesn't disguise it. She's trying to signal to him. And I love the fact that then he comes in, but then the character himself, I think, is probably it's only a tiny bit away from being a villain himself, really. There's the whole thing. I think the fact that all the other male characters are so horrendous, with maybe the exception of the police guy at the end that gives us some fatherly advice. I think they're all so horrendous, the men, that actually Bond, if all the other ones were paragons of virtue, Bond would appear quite, gangsterish himself. But the fact that all these are so horrible, and the tension and the stuff she's going through, and the sort of, threats of rape and on all sorts of things that isn't actually that hidden away. It's very overtly written about. It doesn't hold back from it. I think is makes you genuinely get a little bit of hair on the back of my neck when I read the bit where he turns up. I love that. but he doesn't actually, unlike from Russia, where it's sort of hinted at. They're talking about Bond. They're talking about this guy all the way through the sort of novel. They're setting it up. He doesn't mention Bond until he actually walks through the door, you
That's a
know,
good point.
and that's well over halfway through the book. That's well over halfway book. So yeah, it's quite a different novel for Fleming. I mean, you've got to remember that at that time he was trying to, you know, his wife never took him seriously as a writer. His wife's
Mm.
friends were all literary snobs and kind of constantly berating him, constantly taking the mickey out of him. And I'm sure
She
in the
was
back
having
of
an
his mind,
affair with Hugh Gateskill at the time that he wrote that as well. That's
right,
going to
okay,
be
there we go.
that's going to be a kick in the nuts of your manliness. Oh, she's only dating, like, was he prime minister or just
Yeah.
head of the Labour Party? Whatever, a senior political
Yeah.
figure. That's
Yeah,
going to
exactly.
be
So yes,
damaging to
he
your
definitely. I
self-esteem.
think he wanted to. Yes, and I think he was hoping that this novel would put the critics, silence them. That he was a one-trick pony, and that he
Mm.
couldn't write, you know, Somerset Maugham type, or he couldn't write, you know. I mean, he was good mates with Chandler, but you know,
Yeah.
I think by that time he'd stopped writing or whatever. But I know exactly what you mean by some of it is horrendous, and you know, I've always had a very, very strong moral, you know, standing on any sort of violence towards women or anything. And in this, you read it, it just creeps you out, doesn't it? But
Yeah.
but for me, that tension is released, you know, or certainly dissipated somewhat by the arrival of Bond, because you actually know from this point, if something bad happens, at least you'll be with him, you know, and it won't be,
Mm.
you know, on their terms, it'll be hers, you know, and for me that makes her, you know, an interesting character. If anything, I think when Bond arrives, she probably becomes less of an interesting character, but I don't know whether that's just, yeah, don't know.
Can I just jump in for a second to reinforce a little bit of
Mm.
what you're saying? And also, by the way, not to make out that Fleming was in any way hard done by you
No.
know, a woman having an affair. I mean, he was having an affair with Blanche Blackwell at the same time, mother of Chris Blackwell, founder of Island Records, for those Bob Marley and U2 fans out there. But one of the things that I enjoy about the way Fleming writes, and it is apparent in this, is there is a tension in the gray areas that you've pointed out, because although he is, you know, it's very much a good versus evil, the bad guys, Slugsy and Horror versus Bond, you know, he's clearly the knight in shining armor, they're the evil doers. But there is that gray area where she looks at him, she thinks he's one of them. The policeman at the end is kind of gives her the lecture about how at that level there's you know, they may be on different sides of the fence, but they're similar types of character, which I find interesting. Do you remember Timothy Dalton would always emphasize that when asked about Bond? You know, he's a bad guy on the side of good. That's a terrible Timothy Dalton impression, but you know where I'm going. You know, it's that
Yeah.
that's where you find that energy. It's when there's contradiction and tension and gray areas. That is energetic, and you find that. And again, I'm going to come back to that difficult line and the difficulty that's in there. We know, like, Fleming is reflecting a lot on his personal scenarios in this. Like, when Vivian talks about her earlier lovers, there's the German guy and by whom she becomes pregnant. There's the guy before that who dumps her for an arranged marriage or something like that. She's kind of in the place of, you know, the conquests that Fleming might have had, and he's trying to reverse the perspective and how they would have seen it. And we know that Fleming and his wife had some colorful tastes when it came to sexuality, and we know that you know, there was some sort of, you know, sadomasochistic flavors to that. And I think maybe you see that coming out a little bit. You know, I'm not here to kink shame, but similarly, a line like we're going to get to later on is unacceptable, and it's just, you know, it cannot be defended in any sense. Even back in the day, I don't think you could have defended that line. But I think it indicates a kind of again, a boiled up weird tension in Fleming at the time that's coming out in this novel. His relationships with women, and how he would like to idealize that, how he would like to get out of the complications of his life by making it straightforward, by being a tough guy who could dominate women the way he saw fit. Not
So
that I think is where I found it difficult, because I could not identify with that. But and so that language that was in the book was a little bit hard for me to digest, particularly as a younger reader,
Let's get on to the women then, because like we're halfway through. So let's bring in the main character now, even in the podcast here, and talk about her, because he, just as you're saying, Paul, I mean, there's so much going on, and we're kind of sort of second guessing as well what's going on in Fleming's head at the time. And we know there's so many stories about, well, I wanted to make it, put off people from reading Bond, that he's a tough guy. But yet all of that explanation, this is not a movie. This is a novel from a female perspective, written by a man, kind of turning the whole thing around. So how do we find, and let's get into a bit about Vivian herself, the character, and as well as how she's written. Is she the most, I think Raymond Benson said it, I'm going to ask the question, and Raymond Benson, I think, answered it. Is she the most fully realized female character in the novels? Sean, you give me some thoughts there on how you find Vivian.
100%. Probably just purely by the nature of Fleming writing the novel, it's based from her perspective. So she is the most fully fledged Bond female character that we have. Probably not as known, and she isn't known as a Bond girl or anything. We see it from her situation. The novel is really about her and her perspectives of what happens in a 48-hour period, the second sort of 2/3 of the book. But we like the first part of the book in 3 parts. The first part is all about Vivian and her background, and Fleming goes to great lengths to explain sort of her life and the troubles and demands she's had on her life, and where that's led her right up till this point. He's near setting the scene of her life, and then the second part, the situation that she's in, it goes like, I know you're saying horrendous earlier on. It's near like not a thriller, but more like sometimes like a horror story, that he has no luck. Like for the character, just the amount of sort of trouble she's had over her life, and then by pure chance, luck, she is saved by the character who we all know as James Bond. She just needed that break, for want of a better word. But Fleming does go to great lengths to detail out her background, and sort of we feel her, or we feel her passion. We feel her, I want to say compassion, in terms of, like, to the point that the guys are saying, she opens the door when there's a knock at it, and she goes, "Oh, not another one." Like, it's just her mind goes straight to, there's another bad guy coming here. She hasn't had in her life, I want to say, a father figure. Her parents died really young. She's no guiding light in terms of somebody that she can relate to. And very quickly, and well, I'm sort of going on a wee bit here, but Fleming writes her in such a way, but then the character changes in terms of when she meets Bond. She feels she can relax with him, relate to him. She feels safe, for want of a better word. And I think Fleming writes it very well, because we get her inner monologue a lot, and how she feels about the character of Bond, as opposed to Bond and what he feels. So yes, very much so. Vivian is, I say, the most fledged out female character in all of the Bond novels. So that's a positive.
Yeah.
Still, I was going to say, I found Fleming spends maybe too long giving her a background story, but he is setting it up for the rest of the story. So I'm sort of in two minds over that one, but definitely, yeah, a very, very well fleshed out character.
She's not at the same time, she's not a typical Bond woman, I suppose, in the books, in terms of being vulnerable. She has quite a steeliness to her, given her past. Michael, would you agree with that, or do you think there's more to the character than what we see in the book?
I don't know if there's too much more. So I think Sean brought up a good point, is that, like, you get a lot of her backstory in the first kind of probably 80 pages. The book is just her backstory. So I think, like, by default, she is the most fleshed out character. But I never really fully engaged with her story about how she's, like, from Canada, ended up going over to England, and then kind of kind of a few chapters detailing her relationships with, it'll be Derek and Kurt. And I think it's interesting that she got two different like perspectives of a man. And I think especially after finishing it, you kind of get the idea that Fleming was setting up Bond so that he describes two men who are maybe kind of opposite ends. Derek is definitely kind of a bit of a player, kind of knew there was nothing ever going to happen with it, kind of an arranged marriage, but you never really got the feeling he had any respect for her or anything like that. And then you have Kurt, who probably respected her too much, but never really loved her. So I always felt like her.
Wasn't he the one who respected her enough to send her off to get an abortion?
That's true, yeah. And like, yeah, respected her is probably in a bad way, but he may be in that character's own way.
Yeah,
He says
sure.
this is what she should do, you know. But I feel like the way Fleming wrote it is like he set it up so that when Bond comes in, he's shining a light on this is what a man is supposed to be, and maybe that's a reflection in Fleming himself, you know. But then Fraser brings up the great point of like when she makes love to Derek in the back of a cinema, that's something Fleming probably did himself, and he's probably interjecting himself in a bit maybe in the other two characters as well. But I always kind of got the impression her character was there not for herself, but it was just to shine a light on another aspect of Bond, maybe. Is the way I kind of read her, is that she's almost the catalyst for when Bond comes in, that we can see him through a different lens. And especially when we get to kind of the later chapters, she becomes less of a, I suppose she becomes a bit like a pawn for Bond, where Bond kind of starts, look, you go over here and we go here, and when I give you the sign, you shoot, or whatever. And then towards the end, it's just on about kind of like Bond writes the letter, and yeah, it just kind of seems like, and maybe that's not a bad thing because it is a Bond novel at the end of the day, and like he should be kind of the main guy you come away thinking of. But I always got the impression that her character was just set up so that you could kind of like maybe look at Bond in a different way, or just shine a light on Bond. So that's how I felt.
Is Fraser, I'm going to ask you, is she a doomed character? Because even towards the end of it, and she's kind of, the police, the sheriff is saying, don't fall for these guys, they're all horrible and terrible, and she's like, no, my heart is, I'll always love him for what he did. Is she forever doomed?
No, as Michael was talking then, I just thought, I thought, I wonder if Bond acts more of a palate cleanser for future romance and future relations, because she's had such a horrendous, up to that point, such a horrendous history of men, be it, the men in England through to the two slugs of Slugsy Horror, and then Bond comes in. I think she'd had a great history or whatever. Bond coming in and acting the way he did, and making love to her and then leaving her a note, and then disappearing off into the night. Oh, don't worry, I've informed the police about all this. Everything's going to be great. I want to arrange a bacon sandwich for you in the morning. Maybe that would have been.
Fraser, you've used the term making love and suggested a bacon sandwich in the morning. You are definitely from the 70s, dude.
Exactly. You see what I mean? But no, I don't think she's a doomed character. If anything, I think she might have been doomed. But I think the fact that Bond has, the time she's had with Bond, you might say, okay, he took advantage, all the rest of it, and of course, he did, and we can talk about that. But the fact that he's gone off into the night and it's kind of left her, yes, wanting more, but also aware that actually there is more to relationships than the horrendous history she's had. At least Bond has been reasonably honest about his intentions, and also reasonably detached enough that he doesn't like promise more than he's given. Whereas Derek and Kurt just awful guys, just terrible. That whole thing with her in the cinema just makes you just weep. You just think that has to be autobiographical. No one would come up with that dreadful scenario if they hadn't lived through it. And the whole thing of he that Derek guy's just constantly trying to get his end away with her, and sort of like almost like if you don't sort it out soon, I'm going to find someone else, sort of thing. And then she eventually gives in, and Kurt's almost clinically writing down how the lovemaking was going to go, and setting it all up, and I think he even has 2 days where it happens, doesn't it? It's just and then when obviously she becomes pregnant, he's like, nah, off you go, here's your money. Awful, just horrendous characters. So Bond, I guess for me, probably does act as a bit of a palate cleanser for her, meaning that she might be able to go on and find someone that actually is more genuine. I don't know.
You could even make the argument, Kevin, that sorry, Fraser, but you could make the argument that if you flip that around, that Bond is the doomed character, in the sense that although he has control and then although he has strength, compared with her, I would say she has an odd mix of being naive in one sense and also very analytical and clever in another, which is, part of the reason I wasn't entirely sure I bought Vivian Michelle. But she technically could have, if she'd found the right guy, could have settled down and had a relationship or whatever. Whereas Bond can't. He's forever in a cycle of encountering bruisers and thugs and evil people that he needs to deal with. And he can't really have a relationship, or he does not want one, with the exception, of course, of on Her Majesty's Secret Service. But every time he has one, they're doomed, So for that reason, he is, in a sense, the doomed character in this. But I might be reading.
It's a great point.
Into that.
I was going to ask you about kind of what would you find kind of the opposite of being doomed for her, I suppose, in terms of uplifting. And there's a lot of resilience in there with the character. We see that she's gone through a tough life, not quite good experiences. You do feel for her in that way, and then to go through this, to take horror to another extreme in terms of the two guys coming in and the way they behave and carry on, and her resilience to survive. And she's almost thinking like Bond in a way, because I know we're in her head. And that analytical point that you just said, in terms of if I get the sign on, if I get something here, if I just maneuver my way over, are kind of Bondy in ways of thinking, which Michael made a great point, and I never thought about it when he said we're not in Bond's head though, we're seeing it from the perspective of someone else, so that's why he doesn't feel the way we do. We're not quite as emotionally invested with him. So I will give her credit. She's very resilient. She does come away from it at the end, but still, I wouldn't want anyone to go through what that poor woman has gone through, fictitious or not.
Yeah, Fleming puts his women through a lot. Tiffany Case went through an awful upbringing as well. He does like to make his women feel pain, so that Bond can be their rescuer. But he goes to some dark places to get there, for sure. And you sense that with this. Was one critic I read there said that the reason this didn't work was because it felt like Raymond Chandler crashing into the romance novel genre, And I mean, that's funny, obviously, but you can see a little bit of Fleming perhaps was not his. He was not in his comfort zone, and again, we're crediting anyone from stepping out of their comfort zone to try something creative and new. But he certainly it wasn't the glove that fitted him as well as the standard formula for Bond. I think. Writing it from a woman's perspective. So,
which kind of takes me back to the old thing I said at the beginning about the short story idea. The fact that if this story had been condensed and appeared, at the end of For Your Eyes Only or one of those collections, it kind of would have come across like Quantum of Solace or the other short stories that kind of can take chances and go in a different way. It can because you're not necessarily invested in the whole novel. You're not waited a year for it, I guess, back in the day. And the fact that if you take away all the sort of setup to Vivian's character at the beginning, and you just sort of have a sort of shortened narrative about a girl who's travelled and now she's being tasked with mothballing a hotel, and then the villains arrive, and then Bond arrives, and he says that. Do you know what I mean? If you were to do that, you can sort of see that this wasn't the first time that he made risks or took risks with the writing, but it was certainly the first and only time that he took this much of a risk with a novel. We reviewed from Russia with Love, and we've already talked about that. But that's the other novel that Bond doesn't appear till quite later in the book. But for this, there's no hint of Bond until he buzzes on the door and walks in. And
So is the payoff worth it? I mean, actually, it's a good comparison with From Russia with Love or contrast, because From Russia with Love, a few people have called the Red Grant novel Donovan Red Grant novel that features James Bond. Is this the Vivian Michel novel that features James Bond? Is that the way we would look at that? Maybe he was emboldened by the fact that he had done it successfully with From Russia with Love. Maybe he thought, I can just do it as easily from this. And I can understand where he was coming from. But for me, the failings are the strange characterization of Vivian Michel, and she's imbued with Fleming's kind of smartness and his analysis of the character, but also he tries to give her a kind of an innocence, and she just wants to find the right man. If he'd given her a bit more of the Tiffany Case ballsiness. What I love about Tiffany Case is how she gets abused by men when she's growing up, and she's really ballsy as a result. Maybe if he had given Vivian Michel a little bit more toughness, so that there was a little bit more frisson with Bond, maybe that would have added a different edge to it. I don't know. I'm not sure.
He
Maybe
does.
it
He
would have
does
been
give.
more satisfying.
Fleming does give her a bit of toughness in terms of, like, she does stand up for herself. She's planning to attack the two thugs, and like she was saying, if they're going to take me, I'm going to make sure they suffer as well.
Yeah.
She sort of had flashbacks to whenever in school she was getting bullied, and like sort of she should build up enough courage, and he was writing it in a certain way like that. But if we just pivot slightly, because we were talking about Fleming taking risks, and let's just very briefly have a quick chat about the villains of the piece. And once again, Fleming has changed his whole approach. There's no taking over the world. There's no megalomaniacs. But Fleming writes two characters in terms of horror and Slugsy very differently. And I just want to get a couple of thoughts each, guys. Maybe Fraser, will start with you. What's your thoughts on the characters in terms of the setting, but also the characters of the villains of the piece?
I think the way that Fleming typically writes about villains is there's a theme, and generally they repulse the reader before they've done anything. The description of them, the bloodshot eyes, the gold-capped teeth, the sort of pale complexion of one character, the hairless, disgusting nature of the other one. It kind of before they've even done a thing, you're already like, oh god, this is not good. And he typically, I guess, he always often writes his villains with some sort of thing that makes you think, oh, that's not great. I mean, not always, but I think most of the time, the characters are definitely not from the normal Bond world. These are hoodlums. These are hired gangsters. These are typically the sort of characters that would appear in a Raymond Chandler novel, as you say. It's that sort of character. It's not, it's not some espionage agent or some assassin that's, coldly out there. These are two guys that are paid to do a job. They've done time. They're deadly at what they do. They have no qualms about using and killing, and and literally they are very, very driven in terms of what they want to do. and quite disgusting in the way that they talk about, you know, Vivian, and quite horrible. You know, we talked about the whole thing of Vivian standing up to them and sort of formulating this plan of escape and defending herself and all that. And you really feel for her when she runs tries to escape through the forest. You know, and they got to her. You know, they get to her within no time at all. And there's that whole thing where she sort of like just surrenders like a child would, you know, and hoping that they'll leave her alone then, you know, and that's quite a common thing for a lot of people when confronted with, you know, real danger. Do I stand up, or do I admit surrender and hopefully that'll leave them alone? And that you definitely feel for her, and you know that they're not there to leave her alone. They're going to, you know, brutalize her. They're going to probably leave her for dead, and they're probably going to burn her in the hotel to cover their tracks. There's nothing nice about these guys. So, you know, the whole thing of Bond dispatching them, and you know it's coming, it's joyous, really. You just want him to get on with it because of how awful they are. Yeah.
Brilliant. That was a very, very well put. Paul, what about you? Any thoughts on how did the villains land for you?
Yeah, well, it's exactly as Fraser outlines. It's very black and white. They're very, very dark characters. There's no nuance to them really, and it's set up really as, you know, she has door one, which is rape, murder, and being left burned after her murder, at the hands of Horace Slugsy, or, you know, survival, rescue, and a consensual sexual encounter with Bond. That's door two, and it's very much set up as that, right? So, but it's also odd that, you know, as Kevin pointed out earlier, the threat of rape and murder of one person can be more chilling than the threat of world domination by an evil villain with a cat. You know, in a strange way, the stakes are higher, or certainly more chilling and more gripping. Well, not enough gripping, but certainly chilling, and that's a bit weird. And that's why later on, when Bond goes on and uses that line, and I guess it's probably about time we use that line now, so that people who have not read the book understand what we're talking about. But it's that line where he says, correct me if I'm misquoting, but it's, all women love semi-rape, which is, I mean, by any standards, it's indefensible. And some critics have sort of said, oh, he wasn't really defending semi-rape. He was trying to shock the reader or whatever. I mean, you know, there's no way that can be defended. If you believe in semi-rape, you should go to jail. And that's really all about it is. But I don't really know what the purpose of that line was, except for Fleming's proclivities shining through a little bit, in the sense that, you know, his taste for dominating women was being lived out as a fantasy in his story. But it is quite jarring, and it's an unusual. It doesn't age very well. So it's a kind of yes, the good guy won in the end, but it's again back to that gray area where the good guy is also not exactly, you know, a saint. He's not a super good character. He's a complex individual. It's not the end of a novel where you slide off the end of it and go, yay, triumphant ending, that was great. You're like, yay, that was strange. You know what I mean?
No time to die of novels.
What's that, Fraser?
It's the no time to die of novels. It leaves you feeling
how very dare you? But yes, that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah,
you're quite right. There's no defense of that line, and there are other instances of that in the canon where, you know, he uses not dissimilar sort of statements. So it sort of does put that whole mindset, as you say, had the relationship with his wife, I'm sure, was a very odd one, to say the least. I don't know how widespread his views were in terms of, you know, his relationships, or whether it was just his wife that he was, you know, semi-sadomasochistic with, but
Yeah,
anyway.
but I mean, whatever they did
Right,
within the comfort of their homes in a consensual setting is
Yeah.
all very fine. Role playing, safe words. I don't know how
Absolutely,
this stuff works,
yeah.
but I hear that's how it works. But you know what I mean? It's like it's fine, but a line dropped in like that is like, whoa!
Seems to know very well. how that one-
Don't
how
try
that
this at home, readers. Yeah.
But I think as well, it is completely jarring and inappropriate. But he writes it from
Mm.
Vivian's point of view, which I think is even
Yes.
worse, if that makes sense. Like it doesn't. It's like
Mm.
her saying that and going, "Whoa, where are you going with this?" You know, sort of. It shouldn't even be there. I was reading one other sort of review earlier on, and you know, they're on about sort of changing the novels, and he said that would be the one line out of the whole of the novel. I wouldn't change one other piece, but that one line I would take out. Oh well,
Yeah.
fair point, because it shouldn't be there. It shouldn't be there at all.
I think it was
Michael, what's your thoughts?
the audio book I listened to that line. I don't think it was in there.
I listened to the Rosamund Pike audiobook this time.
Good.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah,
And
I didn't hear it in there. I don't think it's in there.
And I'll jump on
Maybe if
there
we'd let
because
go on.
no, I was going to say I'll jump on because Sean mentioned he listened to the Rosamund Pike one. I initially was thinking I'm just going to read this book and just kind of power through myself, and I found after about 5 chapters, especially with the early stuff describing her past, it was struggle. So at that point, you start thinking, geez, I might switch on the audiobook here now, and that will help me power through. And I thought it was interesting hearing Rosamund Pike because obviously she's a British woman doing a Canadian accent for the vast majority of it. And then when Bond comes in, she kind of goes back to her normal speaking voice, which I find kind of, it was weird listening to her talk as Bond, but you could kind of hear Miranda Frost throughout the whole thing. It kind of felt a bit weird. But along also the lines with the semi-rape line, it's when you read it, I think what it does is it reminds you that it's Fleming writing from a woman's perspective, and it takes you out of the book. It removes you. So even if you do read the book and you find yourself maybe getting into the story and into the characters and stuff, you read a line like that and you go, it is a 50-odd-year-old man writing from the perspective of a woman, which, no offense to him, I don't think he's the leading authority on that, but it does kind of feel a bit wrong, if you know what I mean. Just knowing that Fleming, it just does seem like it's coming from Fleming's mouth himself rather than, you know, naturally from the book. But kind of go back to like Horror and Slugsy, they do kind of feel like just kind of your typical thugs, and the way even Rosamund Pike reads them, the accents she used just kind of felt a bit off. So whenever she was kind of talking from their perspectives or reading their lines, it did feel a bit strange, especially Slugsy. And I don't know, was it actually a good thing? Because it did make me feel a bit uncomfortable the way she read it. And maybe this is just from like a producing aspect, but I felt like listening to the audiobook, it felt like she read very fast at times. And like, so there would be a sentence and a full stop and then another sentence, but it sounded like she just continued through. And like, I don't know, was that a editing thing? Someone went into the edit and kind of cut out a bit of dead air? Or did she just read from one section to the other and it just went by really quick? So I found that kind of jarring from the audiobook's perspective. But definitely, I will say, yeah, the audiobook actually helped me through, to be fair. And it's always lovely to hear Rosamund Pike. So we won't complain about that.
No, we will not. Definitely not. Kev, on back to you.
Yeah, so I think we've covered a lot. I want to kind of talk a little bit about the aftermath and how the book landed with a lot. I think to quote Ian Fleming, the experiment has obviously gone very much awry here. So what are our thoughts there in terms of how the book was? I know it was received in different ways. It was banned in a few countries, but amazingly, I don't believe it was banned in Ireland.
I was going to ask, was it banned here? Wow.
I don't believe it. And if someone is listening and they've come in, let me know. But I haven't found it. I know others have, but I think South Africa did, Australia I think did as well, because of the the content.
Live and Let Die was banned. Is that
Live and Let Die was
isn't it?
banned for about 3
Yeah.
weeks, I think, and then they
Yeah.
as they tended
We
to
don't
do
like
back in the day.
voodoo, but violence towards women, let that fly through. Yeah, that's
I'd let
all right.
that be a reflection maybe of the times that we lived in
Yeah.
then, but in 1962. But
We've got now, yes.
obviously he recognized it. He did not want to kind of discuss it, stopped it from being published until after his passing, where it did actually one of the best of the lot of them. I think people wanted to see what it was about. So what's the legacy of the book, guys? Paul, let's get your thoughts there on the legacy and the aftermath of The Spy Who Loved Me.
Well, my favorite part of the book is when he skis off the cliff at the start. That's great. I love that part. Now,
Classic.
the legacy of the book is, for most people, it's an oddity, and it's a footnote in history. For others, it is a curiosity in terms of why is the film not equal? Why is there no Fleming story in the film? So when you come to the movies and you start to get really into them and you realize that they're all following novels, but that one stands out and isn't. What's the story there? For others, for diehard nerds like this, it really is an oddity because for me, as I said before, it's interesting to see it because it gives you an insight into Fleming's sort of mindset and his, because I think he drove even harder into the escapism element, but you can sense it's fueled with a little bit of extra darkness, and I think that's reflective of where he was at the time. Isn't there a quote from isn't it Bryce? Ivor Bryce says something about it. He's highlighting where Fleming's mindset was at the time. Again, I go back to that point about being stressed from his wife was having an affair, he was having an affair, he was having that strained relationship with Kevin McClory, who was working on Thunderball, and
Did he also have a heart attack at this point? Had he also had a heart attack at this point, I think?
I don't think he'd had a heart attack by 1962. I can't remember exactly. He might have done, though.
Yeah.
I think it might have been after, actually. I think it was between here and Majesty's, but yes. Okay. Comment below if we're not right, guys. Yeah. Let us know.
But yeah, it seems to be I'm strip it down, I'm going to simplify it, I'm going to turn it into the perspective of the woman, and I'm going to make it, really bad guys versus a really good guy, and then he just seems to explore parts of his own experience, as you have highlighted, Fraser, through the perspective of what it would be like on the other side, being a female, being seduced, or having a rough encounter with a cat like Fleming, for example. So yeah, perhaps it might have been a better diary entry or a thought exercise than a novel. But for us fans, it does give sort of a window into his personality a bit. Ultimately, it's not one I return to very often. I do have the book here somewhere. Well, it's buried somewhere, but it's like one that I got years and years and years ago. I never bothered, updating the version of it, which I probably should do, but just for the sake of a collector's completion, But yeah, it's not one I will be dipping into for excitement or even sort of the character of Bond and his process and the way he does stuff, which can be so much fun to read. I don't get that much out of it in this one. To get the payoff in this one, you have to do all the work of reading the first 2/3, and then to feel, as you say, Fraser, that hairs in the back of your neck stand up when Bond enters. But that's a lot of work to get to for one payoff, because at the end, I'm not sure. It's not sure. It's not as triumphant as an ending as the other books. I don't know. That's a long answer to a short question.
No,
Kev.
it's a good question in terms of the legacy. I just want to get kind of to it. Michael, where do you think this stands in the legacy and the reception it got?
I think Paul puts it good with the legacy. It's kind of it is kind of the oddity within the Fleming series. The things I kind of tend to remember Bond novels for is kind of, the normal stuff where it's like, okay, this is the one from the perspective of Vivian. But I also like to kind of find just fun aspects which stick out to me, which I kind of find interesting. One of them is when Bond does leave and he leaves the note to Vivian, and he talks about how he is to kind of, don't worry, everything will be fine. I'm going to get you all your rewards. You're going to get a load of money. I'm going to contact all the authorities. I just imagine if if it was from Bond's perspective and Fleming was writing it, and maybe we got to hear about Bond leaving the morning after because he probably has a shower. He has to change the flat tire in his car. And is Bond the type of character who kind of left and thought, for God's sake, now I have to go contact a load of people to get this thing sorted? Is it kind of a bit of like, not a footnote, but is it kind of a bit of a nuisance to his day? Because he was just planning on going about his business to try get to somewhere, and is now he thinking, man, I have to contact the FBI. I have to get onto all these lads in Washington to tell them about this thing.
So much admin.
Does
Order the
it just
bacon
kind of seem like
sandwich.
does it just kind of
The
seem like a
bacon
bit of a nuisance to him? I wonder how like Bond, what would it be like from Bond's perspective the morning after, and how he'd reflect on it, because we get like how Vivian reflects on the
Yeah.
story, and she definitely looks at him as kind of the Saint George slaying the dragon. This is my knight in shining armor, and he will always be in her heart forever. What does Bond think? What's Bond's whole view of the situation? Is it to him just, well, that was an eventful night, and then we move on, he doesn't think about it ever again? Or so I think that's kind of an interesting thing that this is the second time I read the book, and I remember the first time I read it, that was one of the kind of lasting things that left me. So when I knew we were going to do this book again, it's one of the kind of, I don't tend to remember a hell of a lot about the books. You kind of read them and it all kind of jogs to memory. But one of the things I did remember was like that letter at the end, and like, how would this book or novel be from the perspective of Bond? So that was kind of my lasting impression.
Isn't it a bit like Bonaventura, Donna? I
Donna
forgot the
Lucia.
name. Donna Lucia, exactly.
Yeah.
It's like where
Not the
I did
exact
the
same.
job. I did the job. I got the girl onto the next thing. That's the way because you don't really get Bond's. I agree with you, Michael. You don't get Bond's perspective a lot. You don't get what he's thinking. He just seems to be a guy who likes to win and move on.
Fraser, comments on the legacy, the aftermath, the reception, any of those?
Yeah, I mean, obviously Fleming chose that nothing could be used for a film as such, but although we've had, I mean, the character of George clearly has got metal teeth and quite tall, and got a repelling complexion, so it doesn't stretch the imagination to see that obviously they used a similar sort of character. For me, it's one that I don't really come across a lot of Bond fans that talk about the book at all, really, let alone have read it. And I totally understand, those that either choose not to read the books or no, I don't really understand that. But those that choose to, they've read it and they have a revulsion to some of the things, and I totally get that. That's totally understandable. But I think that there's a lot to be gained from the book. I think there's some real merits there. The Bond character, yes, you talked about what would it be like from his perspective, but we've seen. You talked about it being like a day in the life of Bond, but we've had bits like that with like Moonraker, and where his day-to-day thing, his day-to-day life, his paperwork, it's pretty 9 to 5. The fact that he writes all this stuff, and there's that whole epilogue where the police detective clocks off for the night and gives a parental advice, and that you could have had the book without that. I don't think I think by Fleming writing that bit at the end, I think it definitely, there is a slight distance from the sort of good wholesomeness and the goodness of the Bond character. He's definitely not. He's not necessarily that far away from being a villain. It's interesting that the next novel, which I know we've reviewed on A Majesty's Secret Services, is so much more than this novel. But and I think maybe the experience of writing this, that this had gone down really well, and suddenly, maybe we wouldn't have got Majesty's, we wouldn't have got that whole setup for for the next book. Maybe he'd have written another introspective book or another book that's smaller in terms of its worldview or whatever, and it would have been, we would have been all the poorer for it. So I think it's an interesting book, and if people haven't read it, then I think they should. But they, like with reading Live and Let Die, you need to know that it has some very, very, very difficult passages in it. Yeah.
It's mad to think for a book that was 60 odd years old has that even in it at the time, and attitudes were progressing.
I mean, the whole heavy petting stuff, and some of that is really quite graphic, even by today's sort of standards. I think when I reread it recently for this, I'd sort of forgotten just how much of that is in there. It's quite strong, and it does, it isn't for children. Considering I was a child when I read it, it isn't for children, I don't think,
No.
So,
was that?
I'd like to see. Would you guys like to? Is there any part of it that this novel that you could imagine, if Fleming hadn't selected it not to be used in any way? Is there any part of it that you think would work as maybe like a pre-title? Bond turning up and saying the day to gangsters, and then the credits, the title start, or is this a completely, there's nothing of any interest or should be used anywhere in the film world? How do you feel about that?
I would struggle. I don't know, for like pre-titles I would probably struggle, because you need to set it up in terms of like, it's very quickly how you're going to show Bond's a flat tire, oh he's there, and next thing they're after him. Don't know, Fraser. I don't know. I would struggle, I have to say, personally.
It'd be a long one, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would be.
I just, maybe like a pre-title that was unrelated to the main story of something, and maybe sets up a new Bond, because he steps in, and I don't know. I've often thought
maybe for a point,
Maybe you could. I mean, we've all highlighted the thing that is most electric is after the build up and the tension of what's going on. The entry of Bond into it does give it a chill of excitement, right? Maybe if that could be done by talented screenwriters and a talented director, and a better written scene that did try to sell it from the perspective of a female. We know that can be done well. It was done from the perspective of Madeline in the pre-titles of No Time to Die. It was done very, very effectively, but that was a different scenario. That was a child's fear of it, but an equally monstrous character coming to harm her. If that could be done in a way where, there's a payoff at the end where Bond enters, I think it could be a worthy setup, just, it's not a bad idea. It's definitely not a bad idea.
I'm just going to say no. I'm just going to say no. There's nothing in this book. James Bond stops insurance fraud from taking place and saves. No, sorry. I'm just.
That's correct. Actually, I totally forgotten that.
And I know, look, we've been sympathetic, I know, with the story and the character and the portrayal and everything. But sorry, Fraser, I'm not turning up for a film either to see Bond 2/3 in. I want to see him at the beginning, please. So that's a whole other
way to crash through the notion that the stakes were high. He stops insurance fraud.
Insurance fraud. Unwittingly stops insurance fraud as well. I hasten to add. So
I think if anyone wants to write a bit of James Bond fan fiction, you've got your angle there. It's the person behind the insurance desk who has to deal with all the admin with all of it. It's like, man, someone tried to burn a motel. This thing went down. Now that's my entire week gone, having to deal with the claims. There's a Mr. Spaghetti is his name. I don't know.
Sanguinetti, which
Sanguinetti.
Exactly, yeah, Mr. Spaghetti.
And the managers were called the Fancy, Mr. and Mrs. Fancy. It's a shame that the hotel wasn't called the Fancy Motel as a result. But
ironically, for a character who's so in the movies bent up on destroying things, he has actually saved the insurance industry in this book. Let's, there's good stuff. It's good stuff.
And Bond was
first
so
time
tough
ever.
that even the amount of paperwork that lay ahead of him, he didn't
Yeah.
do any of it because he's such a hard man. Yeah, I'm not sure that would work either.
All right. Sean, any last thoughts there before we wrap up?
No, just I was going to make a similar point to Fraser in terms of we have the novel. Fleming did take a massive risk, but it led into, I think, probably Fleming's best ever novel in terms of On Her Majesty's Secret Service. So he tried it. He obviously tried to distance himself from it very quickly because I think the critics were really hard on him, and he sort of thought it backfired. I think he went maybe a bit too far in terms of not allowing anything to be used other than the title, but it gave us On Her Majesty's Secret Service next, so it's probably he went back to basics, for want of a better word, and Jesus, did he do a good job on that one? So yeah,
it's a good one to end on. Okay, before we go, and I see you're about to jump off. Before we get, I just want you to think out of 5 stars, and we do a little bit of a quick rating, and then very last thoughts. But if you're listening, just if you liked this, because I know this has been a bit of an in-depth breakdown of the book and stuff, but go follow James Bond Club Ireland on Instagram. Where are we, guys? We're on Instagram, we're on TikTok, we're on Facebook,
YouTube.
we're on YouTube, where you can see us right now. Look, I'm waving at you. If you're watching on YouTube, we're all giving that look. We're on the web at jamesbondclub.ie, and we've got the 00 pod as well, that we do loads more conversations and talks with Bond fans, Bond stars, Bond authors, you name it. We cover the whole world and gamut of it from an Irish perspective. So do check us all out online. So now that I've given you all a bit of time to think about ratings, Michael, I'll start with you. Out of 5 stars at the most, where does it sit?
I think she is a solid 2.5.
Solid 2.5. Sean?
I was going to say 2.
2. Right. Fraser?
3, I think, yeah. In the whole canon of things, I think 3.
All right. And Paul?
I'm going to give it 2.
2.
But I don't necessarily think it's awful as that sounds, but it's a 2.
So that is about an average of a 2 and a bit, really, for amongst all of us on that one. So
Where do you
pass
really
level,
have? Is it
but-
above average or below average for you?
it's about average. Average 2 point something with my quick calculations.
Very good.
Okay. Very last thoughts before we go then, guys. Anyone?
If in an alternative universe this had been made into a film faithfully, Roger Moore would have played that Bond very differently to the tough guy who arrives in and beats the hell out of Horror and Slugsy. He'd have swabbed into it and made a couple of throwaway lines into 2. I can't even imagine how that would have transposed to celluloid from the page there. That would have been an interesting one. Maybe Lazenby would have been better actually.
I could picture Lazenby in that role, 100%. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah. Okay. Michael, Sean, Paul, and Fraser, thank you so much for your thoughts and for taking the time and going through the book and giving us your comments on it. Right, we got to go now and figure out the next M's Library edition,
Yes.
which I think might involve a few fights and a drink, maybe, but we'll see.
Hooray.
Is there a
In the book
motel?
or with us?
We'll figure it out. Maybe there's a motel somewhere we can go spend an evening and come up with an idea of what that next one
What could go wrong?
what could go wrong.
Could go wrong.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much. Thank you all for listening and watching, and we'll
Thanks,
see you all
everyone.
soon.
Cheerio.
Bye bye.
Bye.